So the topic of the roundtable is ELF awareness in EFL pedagogy. How does ELF change EFL? Many of these terms and words here are perhaps controversial. Some of them are really interesting, some of them may be old-fashioned, but that's what the topic is, and I'd like, without any further ado, to open the floor to our first participant in this roundtable, Savio Siqueira.
I'm going to try to answer this question, Nikos, from a very local point of view. So, because as you know, we have been discussing ELF in Brazil very recently, as ELF officially entered our national curriculum for basic education. So then I'm going to very briefly talk about it, and then at the very end I'll bring some items why I would say how ELF can how ELF changes EFL. I'm going to start quickly showing here to the audience, even though I'm sure this is a very I would say this ELF audience knows about this theoretical part, but I'd like to start saying that you know, as Barbara Zeidelhofer has brought in her book in 2001, we have to think that there are conceptual differences between EFL and ELF. And this chart is very well known. And also, we know that between ELF and EFL teaching perspectives, there are differences that I'm sure this qualified audience, you know, is already aware of these differences. So, and then I post here just for a couple of seconds for people to read, but basically what several things that Alessia has brought in the discussions that have been happening in the ENRICH program. So there are, because they come from the, you know, the conceptualization of both ELF and EFL is different, so teaching perspectives are also different. So then I would say that, and then ELF travels. So of course, you know, ELF as a field has been here for some time already. And in my case, as I say, from a local point of view, ELF travels and lands officially in Brazil. So with the publication of the Brazilian National Core Curriculum that embraces, you know, the ELF concept, despite problems that I'm going very briefly to talk about. So then the publication with the ELF, you know, anchored in the ELF concept was in 2017, and English was declared by the document as the only mandatory language in basic education. And in the third version of the national curriculum, so ELF appears there, that was embraced and explained considering three aspects: the social and political function of English, multiliteracies with different implications, and ELF-RED teaching approaches where different implications are also explained. But then when it comes to practice, we see easily an epistemological divergence that emerges due to a mismatch between the very fluid and situated nature of ELF with the normative and standardized status of the curriculum, represented in content frames and didactic charts that basically follow, move towards an EFL orientation, and they organize the thematic units based on linguistic features. So based on this, I would say that in our context, ELF meets EFL. And then what do they do then? The dialogue or clash? So then I listened to the teachers, and I brought here very quickly, you know, voices of teachers when they say that, you know, it has been difficult to make my students aware of ELF. They feel demotivated. ELF is still a stranger in my classroom. and distant from our reality. So based on this, so then I'm going to, I have some items here to respond to this question: how does ELF change EFL based on our reality? So then, of course, you know, some of these teachers are more linguistically oriented, some are very much teaching oriented, but some of them go beyond, you know, linguistic elements. So according to my view, in my context, ELF emerges as a new world to be explored in the era of VLT and linguistic education. ELF destabilizes several EFL principles without necessarily disregarding the contributions the field has made to the area of VLT. ELF adopts the concept of language as a social practice, which is something, believe it or not, new to many teachers. ELF makes it clear that EFL efficient communicators are ELF users by default, so they learn EFL, but they speak ELF. ELF deforeignizes English in a way that learners can feel that language will that language will be productively and symmetrically dialogue with their previous repertoires. ELF adds an overt multilingual and multicultural flavor to English classes, rejecting ethnocentric orientations usually adopted in EFL classes. ELF resignifies the intercultural in English classes as much as the place of culture. ELF fosters teachers' autonomy so they can be critical of materials, critical of approaches, assessment systems. ELF stimulates and legitimizes local knowledge and local teaching practices, which is something that we are very much investing in. ELF opens to the reconceptualization of teacher training, teacher education programs on critical and decolonial grounds, more or less aligned to what Alessia beautifully brought to us in her talk. ELF is empowering and by nature an important site of struggle, to decolonize ELT. And finally, ELF opens up important avenues for dialogue between academia and ELT professionals, especially at a local level, because this is something that teachers always say, that a lot of these discussions still remain, you know, at the university, you know, behind the university's walls. So, thank you.
What I've tried to do in this brief presentation, I was trying to bring up, I mean, not so much literature, that I think that there's a lot of literature that has been already brought up in these days, and there will be more. So I was trying to bring up my own thoughts that are still kind of not completely final, but I thought that it would be a good opportunity for sharing what I tried to do in terms of bringing in images what I think is what we are doing here by challenging or by questioning ourselves. What does, you know, how does ELF change EFL? So let's see if I manage, and there will be time, I hope, in the discussion to see if there's any use of this. So I will start by just stating that the incorporation of an ELF-aware perspective into ELT necessarily brings in a critical vision of language as a pluralistic and decentered entity, which is different from the standard monolithic vision found in established models of ELT. Having said this, I will draw from the image that was presented in a very interesting online material by Hall and Wicks Sokono, which is comparing language as either a planet or a galaxy, right? And wondering whether the idea we have of a language corresponds more to this compact, well-defined element, which is a planet, or it's something that's much more complex, diverse, with many different items, with not clear boundaries, that would be a galaxy. So, keeping this in mind, here we would have, you know, the image of what's the learner that approaches learning English, you know, for the first time with all their expectations, and what they meet is this idea of native English, characterized by L1 speech, in which there are formal colloquial and educated examples. In short, there's a galaxy of usages. And when this learner tries to approach this, you know, the whole lot of tradition and the industry and everything have created this package, which is standard educated language, which is very much a homogeneous planet. That's kind of the way that the learner is the place where the learner is directed to, and it's kind of, well, there's a very clear path to this way. And then if the learner is successful and manages to get to this, then they might take, you know, the adventurous opportunity of exploring, you know, more complex elements of native English. Now, we all here know that with this idea of ELF that came up, you know, let's say 20, 25 years ago, you know, things have been reconceptualized, and we now know that there is English as a lingua franca, which is also in itself a galaxy of usages, right? It's a different kind of galaxy because here there's all the multilingual reality of the environment where lingua franca English takes place, with all the situated, you know, communicative elements that brought this lingua franca to happen. But we, at the same time, we do have the challenge of teaching this and teaching a galaxy, you know, teaching something that's complex, that has no clear boundaries, is difficult. So we are all here trying to work on this kind of this, what we could call this elephant in the room, which is how to deal with English in a sort of manageable way, but without betraying, you know, what we know is the reality, which is this complexity. That's why, for example, I've drawn ELF here in this circle shape, but without clear boundaries and exactly the same color as the rest of the lingua franca speech. But you may also know that ELF here is overlapping and taking part of the space of standard English, because, and this is something that's probably, I would say, the elephant in the room. I mean, all of us here presenting, we are all pretty much using something that's very close to standard English, right? So in a way, this is something that keeps puzzling me. I mean, it's something that I haven't openly recognized. And when I talk about ELF, it's like, okay, let's go against standard language ideology. But it's true that we are all kind of users of that. And it's also true that in the same way as L1 speakers are forced sort of to go towards standard in order to be accepted by society with all its, you know, power and control and gatekeepers that we all know about. The same happens with ELF speakers. So there has to be this overlapping area here, right? Which is what I've tried to represent in this image. Now, when it comes to English language teaching, three questions that I think we might wonder and we might formulate are what to teach in formal instruction, what is that we have to include in the syllabus, but also what it is that we have to correct, you know, what kind of things we need to sort of try to avoid and correct our students, and also what kind of things or aspects of language we have to encourage our students to be exposed to. And when the idea was to teach standard English, I mean, this was very clear, right? This was it. Teach the whatever is outside this and be exposed to standard English. Now with ELF, some changes need to be taking place. And so with this in mind, with this broader picture in mind, see that I've eliminated the non-standard native usage, because I think that's well beyond the interest of ELF. I would say that, for example, when we're talking about grammar and vocabulary, when we say what to teach, I think we probably need to spend a lot of energy focusing on this area. That's kind of the overlapping area between ELF and traditional standard. That would be something where, I mean, and where teachers would feel comfortable also incorporating this ELF-aware approach. When it comes to what to correct, definitely anything that goes outside these yellow and orange areas should be could be corrected, because that would mean things that are probably not intelligible, but things that the users, that the learners produce that are within this lingua franca galaxy of usage. So things that are intelligible, things that make use of translanguaging, communicative strategies that bring the conversation forward. They, in my opinion, they shouldn't be corrected. Those belong to the ELF, even though you don't spend time to directly teach them. They are accepted as part of the ELF repertoire. And when it comes to exposing students, I think we should be exposing them to all these range of aspects, the ELF that fits into the standard kind of traditional conceptual language, but also the ELF that is not there, and all the varieties of English that we can find, Old Englishes, etc. When it comes to pronunciation pragmatics, I think that what to teach is much more kind of a matter of freedom of choice. There is really, I don't think we should be kind of constraining ourselves to any particular set of items. But when it comes to what correct, it would be the idea similar to what I said for grammar, and exposing exactly the same. Now, sort of to conclude, I mean, how does ELF change EFL beyond grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, pragmatics? Well, in addition to that, we need to be kind of aware, and ELF brings this awareness of language and social implications, plus awareness of instruction and learning process, as well as goals of learning. But also, ELF changes EFL in terms of culture, because sharing their own culture, students, learners' own culture, dealing with internal diversity in their own home cultures, is a way to be ready to accept diversity in the others. And accepting diversity brings us social justice. That was one of the elements that was mentioned by Alessia's in her talk. And then also, in terms of contents, we need to move from a colonial tourist gaze to the world out there to a more respectful approach to diversity. And I think this is it. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
So I'll be talking about ELF awareness and ELF pedagogy. I'll start with the picture of English as a lingua franca. We recognize that ELF has changed the landscape of English language education. So to some extent, here, while Jenkins also mentioned about that ELF now is positioned from the multilingual perspective. We talk about EMF, English as a multilingual franca. But here, as Alessia just mentioned about translanguaging, while translanguaging has been claimed as a practical theory of practice, like linguistic language practice, can ELF be also regarded as a practical theory of linguistic practice? And here, the first one is that ELF scholars have argued the need for a shift of language policy, because we talk about the general, the big picture of English as a lingua franca. And next one, we realize English as a lingua franca in education. We talk about ELF in English discourse and other like linguistic language discourse. ELF in teacher education, we know that people are doing about this, researching ELF in teacher education, teacher professional development, ELF in material development, ELF in curriculum designs, in policy making, in language assessment. We realize that theoretically, it seems that the English as a foreign language, the EFL is moving from an ELF perspective. But again, as language practitioners, we are always asked this question is, how are these proposals really made an impact in practice? Like whether these proposals can really turn into classroom practice, and to what extent can we claim to incorporate ELF into our classroom teaching? And that is the question, not for us ELF researchers, but also this is a question for the impact of research. How can EFLs be turned to ELF? And the future bits, ELF aware education in the future. Next slide, please. Sorry, thank you. I just proposed to some questions. To what extent can ELF change EFL beyond attitudinal? The attitudinal change, because many studies have demonstrated that, okay, students develop this awareness, that they change their attitudes, and after teacher education, teachers also change their attitude to embrace ELF. But the reality is, after the training and after beyond this attitudinal change, we are still teaching from an EFL perspective, and teachers after the pre-service training or whatever in-service training went into practice, they go to like a classroom, they are required to teach from the EFL perspective because of language policy, because of language assessment. So to what extent can ELF really make an impact, and more practical impact instead of theoretical one, instead of those lip service? And if I realized that many researchers, practitioners have designed those curricula and also like various very helpful materials to be like ELF oriented. But beyond this, how can teachers do to promote ELF aware education beyond the curriculums or material development? How can ELF researchers, how can ELF aware education be incorporated to make a voice for those policy makers and also like scholars, people work in language assessment? And Alessia just mentioned about translanguaging through an ELF pedagogy. I think this is also very useful and very powerful. But the question is, to what extent is translanguaging used in classroom? We don't want to, again, patronize our learners to overuse their first language, right? And how about policy and assessment? And sorry, my last slide is about when we talk about the decolonizing education. So in the contexts, particularly the global south, if we talk about decolonizing education, we need to look at global south. So ELF is responding very slowly from my perspective to make an impact in language education, let alone an inclusive ELF aware education in language policy or assessment. And I think this conference really provide a channel for both researchers and educators to discuss and to make a way forward the ELF aware education. And the last bit is, from my perspective, at least in many contexts that I'm familiar with, I'm now based in China, ELF is much a lip service, and it's a sensitive topic because it goes to a proposal that I was invited to contribute a paper, a column that we planned for a special issue in a Chinese journal. And after several months, I was told, just like last week, I was told that the proposal was basically disapproved by the editor-in-chief of that journal. So it seems that this is still very sensitive when we talk about ELF aware education, right? So that proposal was not accepted. So here we need to see, like, in very many contexts, it's still a lip service. Although many stakeholders have heard of the term, we recognize the needs for language learners, and many attitudinal research studies have demonstrated the need for ELF aware education. But to what extent that ELF aware education is making an impact? So issues such as standardized tests for like profit making, that students still take IELTS to go abroad, and this becomes a standardized test to measure students' language proficiency, and also parents' need for native standards. On the one hand, we mentioned we promote ELF aware education, but parents they don't want their kids to, I don't know, at least they want their kids to learn English with a native speaker of English. So we see this native speakerism is still very salient in many contexts, and also lay people's language ideologies are still dominant in reality. So those are some very big questions for us to discuss and to share ideas together. Okay.
The topic of this symposium is how does ELF change EFL? And although the acronyms are very similar, there is a tension between ELF and EFL. And today I'd like to focus on this tension. English language teaching, ELT, targets the English language as an ideological entity. The construct of the English language is historically and politically crafted, nationally and monolingually oriented, and therefore ideological. Whenever we learn language and communicate, the constructed ideology of national languages, especially standard varieties, as systematic objects remains powerful. That's a reality. So in short, ELT focuses on ideological fixity. However, textbook English is an idealized version of the language, and in line with trans theories, the English as a lingua franca field targets communicative phenomena as observed. So empirically, multilingual practices are always contingent in global encounters. Our real-world communication is translingual. I mean, we make use of our multilingual repertoire, potentially as a way of pursuing social equality. And transmodal. I mean, we draw on available meaning-making resources simultaneously. And also transcultural. I mean, cultural categories, differences, and similarities always emerge during interaction. So the ELF field focuses on pragmatic fluidity. The notion of English as a multilingua franca, EMF, highlights the tension between this ideological fixity of multiple named languages, as in ELT, and the pragmatic fluidity of English users' meaning-making repertoires, as captured in the ELF research. By the way, multilingua franca is not a rejection of lingua franca, but an extension of it to include English communication among those who share the same first language, and multilingual circumstances, multilingual situations, which occasionally trigger multilingual practices. So multilingualism is a kind of inherent phenomena in global encounter. So between ideological fixity and pragmatic fluidity, where should we go? Where should EMF pedagogy go? In other words, how does ELF or EMF can change? How does EMF change ELF? How does EMF change EFL? Okay, I believe EMF pedagogy should recast any norms in EFL as samples to be explored. EMF pedagogy should present instances of linguistic usage and cultural interpretation as discrete examples rather than decontextualized norms. EMF pedagogy should allow students to explore and adapt these examples with all knowledge provisional and continually open to reflection and revision. I believe standard English in EFL would be useful as examples to be explored and adapted, but we should not conflate English in its entirety with standard English in ELT. Again, it should be recast as samples, and how to make use of them in a real-world situation is more important. For this purpose, I suggested EMF awareness in my 2020 paper. There are only two simple principles in EMF awareness. Principle one, we might want to provide students with experiences of EMF scenarios. Principle two, we might want to encourage their critical thinking about language, culture, and identity in reference to their own experiences and in reference to published research. We can use conversation extracts in research papers, for example. That way, we may be able to take a critical approach to communication that challenges dominant essentialist nationalist discourses and focus on processes of communication. So I suggest recasting any norms in EFL as samples and taking a critical approach to communication and focusing on processes of communication. And the final slide. Empirically, Empirical data implies that EMF-aware communicative competencies like this: conscious understanding of linguistic and cultural rules and effects on interaction, as well as meaning-making affordances beyond language. Flexible, situationally appropriate interactional practice based on this understanding, and motivated attitudes or positive feelings and curiosity to difference and others. That's all from me now, and I'd like to thank you for listening.
First of all, let me just highlight how much I agree with what all of the previous speakers have discussed. This writing table, I think, illustrates perfectly how significant it is to integrate ELF and ELT, which I'm going to begin. As Professor Seidelhofer said yesterday, implies an evolution rather than a revolution. I've been thinking about this phrase since yesterday and about the difference between these two words. Well, as far as I can see, both words mean that you try to overturn things somehow, or that you try to liberate yourself from something that does not work for you anymore in order to change it and build something new. And while revolution may not necessarily imply that what you build is better, evolution means exactly that, that you build, that what you build works in a better way, and that it makes more sense to you, either as an individual or as a community in general. In that sense, of course, evolution means development, the way that's defined by psychological theories, by cognitive theories, and so on. So regarding the topic of this roundtable, that is how ELF changes EFL, we also need to focus, I think, on two things. First, on what is being developed when it comes to teaching and learning, and second, on how development can be achieved in practice. About the first issue, what is being developed? As the previous speakers have also argued, all of them, I think it is mainly our perceptions, that is how we view things pertaining to using, teaching, and learning English, which in essence, I think guides how we act, that is what we do as users, teachers, and learners of English, respectively. Drawing on the work of Professor Widdowson and Professor Seidelhofer again, which, as you can tell, has been a great source of inspiration for me. ELF primarily implies that the way we have traditionally perceived the acronym TEFL, teaching English as a foreign language, does not work for us anymore. It does not make sense. And we need to liberate ourselves from it in a way that helps us evolve. This includes, for instance, the way we view the process of teaching, and in turn, the way we view our learners as passive recipients of whatever we have traditionally been teaching them, that is, as the G's in Professor Widdowson's and Professor Seidelhofer's terms, or as active users of ELF, who may need to develop their communicative capability even further. Of course, this also includes how we view English itself. Whether we view it as a single unitary entity, as we heard a few minutes ago, or whether we can embrace the flexibility, unpredictability, and creativity of ELF. And, as expected, whether we view it as something that is fundamentally foreign to our learners, or whether it is something that is familiar to them, as Nikos Efakis has also argued. Something that is that our learners can feel that belongs to them as well, and can therefore change it in any way that makes sense to them. Now, I've used these phrases here in my slide because development means movement. It means moving, as we said earlier, from something that doesn't make sense to something that does. Without though removing things, without abandoning our past, but rather building on it to create something that works in a more functional way. Speaking from personal experience and as a teacher myself, this movement does not happen overnight and definitely does not happen automatically or magically. This brings us to the second issue that I briefly referred to earlier, that is how development can occur in practice. The tools for that can be found in the field of transformative learning. And I think that ELF makes the need to integrate those tools in ELT more urgent than ever. I've heard the words resistance, the words the fact that people, even though there's an attitudinal change, people go back to the classrooms and teach the traditional way. Well, transformative learning has answers for these questions. And what does this field tell us, in short? It tells us that to be able to move from something dysfunctional to something that makes sense to us, we need to engage in critical reflection. But what is that exactly? It is returning to our experience and identifying not only those perceptions that have been dysfunctional, but most importantly, why we have had those perceptions. What has influenced us and how? And why did it make us think, for instance, that that native speakers are the benchmark of perfection? It could be our teachers, could be our parents, could be society in general, could be a friend. Whatever it was, we need to see what it was in order for us to be able to liberate ourselves from its influence. So this field, now the traditional learning, the transformative learning field, also highlights the value of reflective dialogue, because it's great if you can analyze yourself and your whole biography, but it's even better if you do it with other people. If you can share your concerns and see that you're not alone in this very demanding process. You need the reassurance that even though you break free, from something that has been influencing you, it's okay for you to feel sad, it's okay for you to feel inappropriate, it's okay for you to feel that you're changing in some way. Another thing that it highlights is that true change, true development is not one-dimensional, much like English itself. We need to take into account people's emotions and other psychological factors, their cognitive development, especially since we are also talking about learners, and even constructive developmental theories, which in short show that people don't reflect the same way and therefore don't change the same way. And this may explain why, for instance, in some courses, other people progress more and other people don't. And this is not a matter of intelligence, it's not a matter of maturity, this is not a matter of educational background or qualifications and so on. This is a matter of reflective capacity. And the transformative learning field, and especially the constructive developmental theories, can provide us with insights that we can use in our practice. We need therefore to view, I think, each teacher and each learner as an individual who has his or her own biographical background and his or her own developmental needs. I'm going to stop now so that there's enough time for Professor Widdowson to share his much appreciated perspective on everything that we've heard in this roundtable. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your comments about the whole roundtable.
I will attempt to offer something. Not easy, because what has been said, not only in this colloquium, but throughout the entire conference so far, has been so complex and so detailed. It's very difficult, actually, to pick on any particular issue. But what I'd like to do is mention a couple of thoughts that I had, really as issues that perhaps call for further critical inquiry. And the first is one that I suppose it was Fang's comments that sparked it off. And that has to do really with the impact of the project. I think it's greatly to be welcome that there has been so much attention paid, and Savio mentioned this also, to local considerations. Because previous proposals for innovation in language teaching, new paradigms, as it is sometimes mistakenly called, have tended to be top-down impositions, which disregarded local contexts. The local context we considered as constraints that prevented the new Enlightenment to get people to convert to the new Enlightenment, instead of seeing them as necessary conditions for implementation. So in many parts of the world, and particularly outside Europe, I think, the communicative language teaching, for example, was imposed. There were proposals from the Council of Europe, the threshold level, the CFR, and so on, and it was assumed that these could be transferred into other contexts where they might meet constraints, but where these could be disregarded and somehow imposed, so that what was intended for the European context was suddenly seen to be the answer to everybody's pedagogic prayers in all parts of the world. And I think there's always a danger of ideas that originate in one part, particularly the most prestigious and influential parts of the world, to be assumed to be necessarily relevant elsewhere. So I think that the whole principle of what Nikos, I think, talks about, the principle of essentially non-interventionist, I can see that the virtue of that. However, and this is where I think we need to, if you like, to sound a cautionary note. And I'm referring to what is known as the Hawthorne effect. This is defined, and I've got a definition here, as behavior of the subjects of a study due to their awareness of being observed. In other words, and I think we've seen this in many, many cases in the past, you will get enthusiastic responses from the people that you're doing research with, or the people who you've designed in-service teacher education courses for. They go away highly enthusiastic, fully aware of the significance of what you've told them, but then, of course, return to very different conditions of the classroom, where they've got opposition not only from policymakers, not only from the curriculum, not only from the textbook, but from their colleagues, and where they find it very difficult to actually, in the actual circumstances of their local classrooms, to implement the insights that they have accepted and are aware of in the courses or the awareness-raising activities, which has been a part of their in-service or in-service courses. So the one cautionary note would be the need, in a way, to go beyond the kind of the ENRICH project. There is a further stage, and I think it was that, if I understand him correctly, that Fang was referring to, the opposition of, if you like, deeply entrenched conventional attitudes. So it's not just the teachers, it's the pressure that's upon them and the whole system to conform. Because we're talking about something which is essentially creative. And creativity implies that in some sense you are being nonconformist. You're going against established tradition, established beliefs. And in some countries, these are extraordinarily powerful. In Europe, they may not be. In some cases, particularly, but you can overcome. And in some cases, in Brazil, for example, as we've heard, it is possible for the conventional tradition to be shifted, but by no means everywhere. And even when shifted, one doesn't know how this is to be interpreted in the class. We've heard often enough of how curricula appear to be on the side of the angels, so to speak, but once they are implemented through textbooks and courses, their innovation becomes conventionalized. So that was my first thought. This is not a criticism. It's a suggestion that there are issues here which do call for further thought, further inquiry. The second issue takes up this notion of awareness, which is mentioned in the definition of the Hawthorne effect. Now, much has been said about language awareness. In fact, language awareness is the central pillar, Nikos, I believe, I'm right in saying. In fact, it appears in the way you described the project as being central to the ENRICH project. Language awareness, the study of language awareness has, as most people will probably know, a very long history. There is an association of language awareness, which was founded in 1994. There have been 15 conventions on language awareness internationally. There have been abundant publications about language awareness. And this obviously raises the question, how far language awareness, as represented in the ENRICH project, relates to, corresponds with, contradicts the kind of issues which have been dealt with over the past 25 years. There are many aspects, of course, of English as a lingua franca that people can be aware of. I think one was touched upon, I think, again by Savio, when he refers to socio-political issues, and indeed the whole colonialist question that has been raised. Because it's not, to be aware of another language is to be aware of the way in which it is foreign in relation to one's own. In terms of its phonology, in terms of its syntax, its morphology, and so on, in terms of the conventions of its use, in terms of your attitude to it, and the history of your relationship with the speakers of it, which is where the colonial feature comes in. Because English is clearly foreign in Brazil in a very different way from the way it is foreign in Indonesia or in India. Foreignness is a very complex and varied concept. And there has been a tendency to think of foreign languages as all alike because they're all foreign. But how do you actually relate to the foreignness of English varies enormously from one situation to another. So one needs to ask, well, what kind of awareness is it that is relevant to ELF awareness? And how does ELF awareness differ from the issues of awareness that have been previously discussed, as I say, over the past 25 years. And one apparently distinctive feature about ELF, about which we should all be aware, is that it is multilingual. And multilingualism figures as part of the description of the ENRICH project, and indeed it has been abundantly discussed at this conference. And Alessia, of course, in her excellent plenary, referred to multilingualism and translingualism. And the question, I think, arises that is worthy of further thought is, how far is ELF multilingual in a way that other uses of language are not? Now, Kurt Kohn, in his talk, made reference in passing, or made the point in passing, that what is called monolingual English is itself, or English, the use of English monolingually, is itself intercultural. And he thought, if you talk to your teenage son, or talk to your wife or your neighbor or whatever it is, you're engaged in relating to somebody else's concepts of reality, history of experience, etc., which is what cultural difference is. Now, if all language use is intercultural, does it not follow that all language use is also multilingual? And what then is it that's distinctive about ELF communication? So if one takes the view that multilingualism or the use of a range of resources on your repertoire is what all language users do, and it happens that some of these resources have a different label. But going back to, again, to this very nice image, Enric's image of the planet, it's not that English as a native language is, what was the term that Tomo used? An ideological fixity. English, as a so-called monolingual language, is not a fixity. It's enormously varied, and shifting from one dialect or form or one is part of your repertoire to another is a code switch in a sense. And this is something that sociologists like Bernstein, for example, pointed out many years ago. So the interesting question, I think, arises as to what is it actually, or what is the significance of the fact that there are traces of other named languages in the use in ELF usage? And is to be multilingual the same as to be translingual? The terms seem to be used in free variation, but one would have thought that if one talks of being translingual, this transcends languages. And if one talks about multilingual, one is surely, is one not reifying languages as separate? It's a plurality of different languages that come together. But surely many of the arguments that we've heard at this conference suggest that it's a transcendent process of overcoming the differences between languages, and that people incorporate features from their repertoire which happen to come from different sources. And multilingualism is more obvious, of course, when the language is concerned are very different. But again, one may be over-persuaded by a Eurocentric view of multilingualism. certainly, if you look at other parts of the world, and then parts of Africa, for example, the difference between one language and the other, one language, so to speak, fades into another language. And there's a transcendence of linguality, which is noticeable. And I just raised the question, is it not translingual in that sense, not multilingual, that we're talking about when we're talking about how ELF is used in communication? I've gone on too long, I'm aware, so I will stop there. But these are two issues that I thought might be worth thinking about critically.